Hey, welcome to Q&A, where you ask your questions on faith and life, and I do my best to give a biblical perspective. Hey, we have a great question today, a question which I know for some could be a little bit controversial, and I totally get that, and I would love to hear people's opinions on this topic. And if you want to post your opinion, all I would say is that please be respectful of people who perhaps hold a contrary view to the one that you do. This is not a hill to die on. I think we can have different views. I just think we should learn to engage respectfully when we encounter views that are different from our own. And so now you're wondering what the question is. So let me read it out. If, as Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, that he doesn't permit women to preach, why do most churches allow women to preach today? Like, was it a cultural thing? And it's a good question. As I say, it's a controversial question. I'm aware that in America, the Southern Baptist Conference is busy debating this topic in terms of women being pastors, etc. So it's certainly one of those issues that's current for us. Inherent in the question is, I think, a slight misunderstanding of what exactly Paul says. You've said that if this is your question, and I know many people would phrase it like this, so I'm not getting at you if this is your question, that Paul doesn't permit women to preach. Let me read out what is actually written. It says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over man, rather she's to remain quiet. And the reason I say that is that it's a little bit more nuanced than simply saying woman can't preach. I mean, clearly he's forbidding something. I guess the question is what? And at first glance, it looks like that he's really saying that he doesn't permit women to preach or to exercise authority over men. And so, we begin to have debates around that. There's a strong argument that if you were to look at this in Greek and the way that it's written, the way that Paul would have written it, that what he actually writes is in fact one and the same thing in terms of not permitting women to teach or to exercise authority. What he's forbidding, really, if you read it, is that he's forbidding women to exercise leadership over men through teaching. He's not actually forbidding women to preach as such. And that would be probably the majority understanding of this text, that he's not forbidding women to preach as such. He's saying, I don't permit women to exercise leadership over men through teaching. You've asked, is it a cultural thing? And I'll come back and expand what that earlier point. But first of all, you've asked, is it a cultural thing? I've got to be honest and say, I don't think it is. I don't think it's just a passage that Paul was writing for a particular time and season, and back when he was addressing Timothy in Ephesus, because he bases his position on a call to creation, not to a cultural situation. So I don't think that you can say it's just a cultural thing. I don't think you can dismiss it that lightly, because his appeal is based in creation, and that's not cultural. It's transcultural. And so I don't think we can get around it just by dismissing it as a cultural thing, as appropriate then but not appropriate now. Which of course begs the question, what do we do with the text today? Well, first of all, I think, as I alluded to before when I said I'd come back to what Paul meant, I think we have to recognize that Paul doesn't forbid women in leadership. I think of Romans chapter 16, verse 1, he talks about Phoebe, who was a deaconess, which is a position of leadership in the church. So, and we said elsewhere that he appeals to the role of women in the church. If you were to read through the whole of the New Testament, you find that women played a significant role in various aspects of leadership within the church. So he's not forbidding women in leadership per se. Likewise, as I alluded to earlier, Paul doesn't forbid women from preaching or for teaching. There's many examples, but let me give you an example that is more than just a woman-to-woman type situation. In Acts 21, for example, it talks about Philip's daughters who prophesied, and that was to prophesy then was to bring forth the message of God. It was a form of preaching. And Paul never calls that into question. Likewise in Acts chapter 18, I think it's verse 24. Let me bring it up just so I get it right. It's where Apollos, he's talking about, Luke's talking about Apollos, who as Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians. Here we go. Acts, beginning at verse 24, it says, Apollos, an eloquent speaker who knew the scriptures well, had arrived in Ephesus from Alexandria in Egypt. He had been taught the way of the Lord, and he taught others about Jesus with an enthusiastic spirit and with accuracy. In other words, he knew the scriptures and he was faithful and accurate in them. However, he knew only about John's baptism. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him preaching boldly in the synagogue, they took him aside and explained the way of God even more accurately. So there's Priscilla having a teaching ministry, and Paul doesn't seem to take issue with it. Long story short, I think when we come to this passage, and we don't have time to do it justice and to look at all the pros, all the positions on this text and unpack them biblically. This is just a once over lightly, so to speak, which is why I know it's not satisfactory, and you're going to post comments most likely with other scriptures, and that's fine. I get that. But I think that if you were to read the New Testament and it's in fullness to get the big picture, what you'd find is that the Bible allows, and Paul specifically allows, for women in leadership, and the Bible allows for women to preach and to teach, but I don't think the Bible allows for women to lead a church. To lead a church, it means to exercise a form of headship, and to do that requires teaching, it requires correction, etc., which Paul in this passage and others says he forbids on theological grounds, not cultural grounds. So I don't have a problem with women exercising leadership within a church. I don't have a problem with women preaching in church. I think that the line is drawn at women leading a church because of what that entails in terms of pulpit ministry and other things. So that's how I look at that passage. I don't think it's a cultural thing. It's a very specific thing that he's forbidding, not just women in leadership or not just preaching. It's a more nuanced than that. But hey, as I said, you've probably got some views. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Just be respectful if you want to challenge something that someone put. But there's no problem with disagreement. But hey, as always, if you've got questions on faith and life, you can ask them on slido.com. Use the hashtag ALC23. We'd love to hear from you. But that's it for now. Until next time, God bless.